lab where I work with code on the input side of textiles. So I work with industrial machines that make the fabric itself, and the machines are controlled by code that I write. One of the awesome machines I work with is a knitting machine. Right? Knitting, for those of you who haven't met it, it's one of the ways we have of turning a yarn into a full surface through careful intermeshing. So in knitting in particular, the surface is made out of a grid of loops. The path of the yarn zigzags from the bottom to the top. The loops next to each other are connected by being knit continuously with a length of string. And the loops stacked vertically each hold a loop from the previous line. And each loop is held in place by another loop in the line above it. That's important. A loop that has not yet had another loop pass through it can be thought of as live or temporarily unstable. So this swatch is just held with friction, and you could unravel it by pulling the thread as you walk away. In hand knitting, the live loops are all held next to each other on one long needle, and the new loops are pulled through each other by another needle, which then acts as the holding place for the new unstable row. And in machine knitting, each loop is allocated to its own hook-shaped needle, which is capable of pulling a single new loop through the one that's parked on it. Here's an animation of the new loop being formed. I'm going to let us watch that for a couple seconds. I also have this sweet hand crank version if you want to come play with it after the talk. Recommend it. Turn the crank and it knits. So this, what you're seeing here, the knit stitch, is arguably the most important atomic operation that the machine can do. Relatedly, a second atomic operation is the tuck stitch, which adds a loop to the needle without pulling it through and therefore dropping the previous one. You can use tuck stitches for textural effects. You can use them for adding elastic or doing color work. It's important if you're using two different yarn colors, for example. And sort of, just to throw it out there, topologically, the very first row you knit is necessarily a tuck row because there's no previous loop there. A third atomic operation is the transfer. So there are actually hundreds of these hook-shaped needles. They're all very tiny, and they're arranged in two rows called beds. So we're seeing both beds in that picture, and they meet at a 90-degree angle. So any of those needles can hold a stitch, and also any of those needles can transfer a stitch from one of the beds to the other, to the needle that's directly opposite on the other bed. So we can transfer from the front bed to its corresponding needle on the back bed, or vice versa. Relatedly, we can also change the alignment of the two beds. So this is called racking the back bed, and it moves the entire back bed sideways. Okay, so that's 4 big things we can do. And how are they useful? 4 things. Let's look at some swatches. So rectangles are really easy. We can just knit some stitches in a row, make another row, and we keep going. And note that in this slide, we're reading from the bottom to the top, because that's how the stitches are formed. Gravity makes it so. Okay, how about lace, though? That's kind of complicated looking, right? A lace is any fabric with a pattern made of holes. So there are actually lace-making methods for all of the textiles processes. In knitting, when we want to make a hole, we can't just drop a stitch, right? Because every stitch has to be held by at least one other stitch, or else it and all of its predecessors will drop. You can move a stitch out of the way by transferring it onto its neighbor. So the way we do that is we transfer it to the other bed, we move the other bed one way or the other, and then we transfer back up to its original bed. And then note that the stitch above that hole is a tuck stitch because it doesn't have anything to pull through. Okay, what if we move a whole chunk of stitches over and like maybe all the way to the edge? We have a fabric that is now slightly narrower. Or conversely, we could move some fabric outwards and we have a fabric that is slightly wider. Okay, this is my Julia, this sounds kind of boring, but I tell you it's really amazing. Because fabric that is slightly narrower or wider is how we make complicatedly three-dimensionally shaped fabrics for our complicated three-dimensionally shaped bodies. Okay, so we've got the ability to make these arbitrarily shaped surfaces out of these 4 atomic operations, and these are machines that exist right now in industry. And I think we can probably assume there's some really cool UI that fancy designers in loft spaces are using to tell these machines what to do. No. Here is the proprietary programming language that is used by the company that made the machines that I use. It's a 2D array of color values, aka pixel art. You read it from the bottom to the top, and each horizontal line of the pattern corresponds to a pass of the carriage. The carriage is what actually articulates the needles. Because they're so tiny, There's not like a solenoid hooked up to each one. They follow a cam path in this physical hunk of metal that hurtles from side to side and articulates them. Okay, this is just one part of the pattern because they get tall very quickly. So let's zoom in. Okay, stuff in the middle is essentially stitch-by-stitch instructions. Most of the available color combinations are shorthands for combinations of the operations that we went over before. So colors 51 and 52, which are obviously pale pink and pale green, correspond to the front and back bed knit stitches. So you see those stripy areas is knitting a tube, again, obviously. And those sort of purpley colors lower down are transfers forward and back. The streaky lines up the side are called option lines, and they carry machine instructions for that entire carriage path. So the rack value, moving the bed side to side, is set by one of those lines, which is a lie, actually. It's set by two of the lines. It's set by the mauve and purple line and the red and yellow stripy that is going on. And they interact in kind of an inexplicable way. And what yarn we're using is set by another one, and you can do repeat blocks as well. So yeah, so this is pretty easy to read, but it gets out of hand really quickly when we're talking about something more like a glove, for example. I've spent about 6 months learning to read these. This is a real system that we really actually use in industry. I'm pretty sure we can do better. A large part of doing better is going to involve physically or doing visual simulations of the object, right? Because that's kind of one of the better ways to do UI, in my opinion. But we also need to think about what abstractions we're going to build on top. So one thing we can do right off the bat, we can do some loops. There's a joke, because knitting's all about loops. So this is really straightforward, right? It's a nested loop, and we're making a rectangle. This is overly simplified because it turns out we actually care about directionality. We care about whether the yarn is coming in leftwards or rightwards into the loop, and we also care about whether the loop is being pulled from the back to the front or the front to the back. And back to front and front to back is determined by which bed we're using. So we really want something more like this. Because we're alternating rows going left and going right, we need to take them 2 lines at a time. So this is what it actually looks like to knit a rectangle, sort of. This is still simplified. Okay, so how about the business with moving stitches around, right, with all the transfers and racks? So this is basically just a pseudocode version of what I showed you earlier, where we're transferring back, we're racking the bed over, and then we're transferring forward again. And it turns out it's a good idea to set your rack back to 0 so you're set up for the next time around. This is great. This is all we need if we're just transferring one stitch around. Something we haven't talked about yet is knit time efficiency. Yeah. One of the nice things about this format is that they make visible something that's actually really important, especially in industry. I said earlier that each horizontal line corresponds to a physical pass of the carriage. It's a thing that takes time to do. So there's actually a direct correlation between the height of this drawing and how long it's going to take to knit something. And one of the things that we'll get really quickly is the transfers, because transfers have to happen in a row all by themselves. And remember, we can only set the rack value per line. So this thing that I just coded up takes a minimum of 2 passes, which is great if you only want to do one transfer, or one sideways movement. But if we're talking about a lace where we've got like 300 stitches in a row that all want to go over by 1, and we just naively call this thing 300 times, we're talking about 600 passes for a single this tall row of knitting. That's a bad idea, probably. It's probably a bad idea. So we want to do something more like this instead. Let's transfer all of our stitches back at the same time and rack it and transfer them all forward at the same time again. Yeah, this looks really good, but what if the stitches are going to go to different locations? They're not all going +1. Maybe one of them's going -1, one of them's going +1. Or maybe they're swapping places like it's a cable knit. Or what if we want to narrow a fabric evenly across its width? So the ones on the edge are being moved in by quite a lot. The ones in the middle are either staying in place or just moving over by a little bit. Here's a fun one. Also, the machine has a maximum amount that it can rack over. It's